welcome to my CanJam Singapore 2025 report. Firstly, I'd like to thank a number of people for their support, my patrons, of which there are way too many to mention, Hi-Fi Man for helping me get there, Enlium for sending me gear to help review with, Elise Audio and members of the Watercooler team for suggesting IEMs I should try, and of course Jude, Ethan and the other Headfire staff for their help, and of course putting on the show. Also, I'd like to thank everyone who came up to me and chatted with me and suggested stuff and gave their impressions of things, as that helped a lot as well. At the behest of a number of friends and supporters, both online and in person, I decided to try as many in-ear monitors as possible at the show, especially some of the famous high-end models. I haven't been into the IEM world very much recently, so it was interesting to get back in and listen to some of the progress that has been made with high-end models, and I'd have to say I am quite impressed. Now, to ensure that I could get a good experience, I brought Chord's Hugo 2 and Tugo with me, as well as an Enlium HPA23 RMH, which was kindly assembled for me by Enlium just before the show so that I could test even the most challenging in-ear monitors to their maximum potential, at least as far as general portability was concerned. Now, I loaded up a micro SD card in the Tugo with some of the very best recordings I have, which will be in the description of this video. I also brought with me Apple's USB-C audio adapter, and this actually wasn't for testing, but rather given that few people in the IEM world know me, I'd pull it out at tables when preparing to listen to some or other, very expensive multi-$1,000 high-end IEM and ask if it was sufficient to use with them. And after seeing various negative reactions, I'd say I'm just kidding and pull out the Hugo 2 and Enlium stack, which brought an even more surprised reaction. On to IEMs, my general observations are that a lot of people like IEMs similar to how Critical's Meta is tuned, which I describe as having a slightly V-shaped tuning versus, dead neutral, whereas I prefer one that is slightly more neutral, closer to Critical's Daybreak. Now, ideally for me, if I don't have to think about the tuning but can appreciate the music, then the result is perfect. Now, I listen mostly to acoustic music, and that really defines my bias towards instrument timbre and accuracy here, as I'm particular about the sound of piano, violin and percussion, which are the hardest to reproduce accurately. Now, some IEMs, for example, had the ideal mid-range and treble, such that I felt I was hearing instruments and vocals very clearly and delivered very well, but then had really excessive mid-bass, which somewhat ruined the effect. That being said, the difference between now and about a decade ago when I last tried IEMs is really substantial. If you want to know the details of what I listened to, I have a list of the music I had on my Tugo in the description of this video. Lastly, before I get into impressions, you should note that IEMs really don't have a soundstage, as the pinna, or I should say the outer part of your ear, which is necessary to determine the position of sounds around you, is bypassed. However, there is some degree of perceived soundstage, a combination of frequency response, phase and group delay characteristics, so that whenever you hear me say soundstage, in your mind just add the word perceived before it as well. Now, of course, I evaluated all in-ear monitors or headphones with whatever tips or pads that the manufacturer provided me. As I knew the show was going to be very busy, I decided to get ahead of things and go down to Critical's Hangout to check out some IEMs in advance. Now, the first of those that the shop guys, who were very kind, recommended to me was the Moondrop Meteor. Now, listening to the Cowboy Junkies, this was a kind of V-shape to me with, the mids and treble were very good, but had a messed up and a weirdly disconnected bass, which the guys there described as probably the funniest description I've ever heard of bass was like punching a pillow. And so that was probably not a bad description for them. Impressively, the sense of depth to the soundstage was very good from these IEMs, almost excessively so, and it had very nice imaging if you do like space. For example, you have Bonobo's We Could Forever, and the bass on that isn't bad, but it just seemed like out of whack with the tuning, like someone turned up the mid-bass dial on the EQ way too far. Now, a different pair of IEMs, the Softears Volume S, again, the same Bonobo, had an edgy treble on top of a warm but somewhat incoherent soundstage that only had the occasional good moment. And the 1009 was better, showing more decent bass. Speak No Evil was too sharp with these IEMs, with an average soundstage in all directions, and piano timbre was decent. Now onto some headphones, Sennheiser's HD505, which I kind of missed out on evaluating in New York. Now listening to Ramble On It had a fairly even sound signature with bass on the lighter side and mids that were a touch shrill, which is kind of expected at this kind of price range for headphones. Having a listen to the old classic Massive Attack's Blue Lines album, the treble was a touch shrill, again with fairly tight bass, although that's probably the amplifier. Vocals are clear when they're not sibilant, and so in the end, maybe a pretty decent pair of inexpensive headphones. One of the unexpected things was to meet a fellow Australian, and in the case of his name is Josh, and his brand of IEMs that are upcoming is called Prisma. He had two different models there, the first of which is the Lux. This played Harry Manx's San Diego Tijuana with great dynamics and bass when needed, rather than just there all the time. It really needed the current output from the NLM to get best results. Now it was a bit bright, but kind of otherwise excellent with really good vocals. Now the Lumen was one that I really liked. Described as having more of a vocal focus, so that's more my kind of tuning, which is nearer neutral. This was really spot on for me, and Harry Manx was just right. Bass, again, present but not intrusive, and the treble there but not overly sharp. Both of those things which I really like. Switching to the Cowboy Junkies, I'll Never Get Out of These Blues Alive, the cymbal timbre was near perfect, with maybe the only slightest imperfection, and the mid-bass was maybe just a touch overpowering. Given that it has a flat impedance, it will work really well out of things like the NLM with its current output that does require a flat impedance for best results. Some years ago I reviewed an AME, IEM the Argent. This was a new company at the time, and I'd met them at one of the Tokyo headphone festivals, and since then they seem to have stuck around and produced some quite serious models. Their latest model, the Igris, which is in prototype form and according to them about 80% done, I found it that even at that stage it's pretty excellent, and given that it's supposed to be a less expensive model than their usual kind of $4,000 odd models, if you can accept, they're under $2,000 is less expensive, it has one dynamic driver, 4 balanced armature and 1 planar driver, and the treble of the Cowboy Junkies Shining Moon came through very well despite the bright track, and I heard good instrument separation and soundstage and excellent instrument timbre. Likewise, Dead Can Dance Indus was amazing, not with huge bass, but with a spacious and totally engaging sound with which the Igris set a high bar for me for the rest of the show. Of their existing models, the Mousa has more bass, and Indus was presented with more bass than the Igris with a slightly warm mid-range. The treble was, pleasantly, not overemphasized, and the overall sound was extremely clean, that is free of general negatives. Drums were very distinct from this IEM, even the lighter ones, and it reminded me of Sony's MDR R1 headphones, which were tuned after it was either Duntech or Dunleavy studio monitors. The Raven is closer to what I call a classic gentle V, with less distinct vocals and drums. Now I found vocals fairly captivating from this IEM, though not as much as the Igris, despite it being more expensive and to my own preferences. They also had the Gaia, which has a more U-shaped tuning, that is a brighter sound with less mid-bass, but good low rumble. All the same, the sparkly treble was extremely clean, and I thought it was pretty good how they managed to have a variety of high M's with your choice of either kind of vocal focus, neutral tuning, slightly V-shaped or U-shaped tuning for preference. Someone suggested me that I listen to SAEQ's new Harmonia, if I pronounce that correctly, and at over $4,500, I found that Dead Can Dance was lighter and more spacious sounding. Some aspects of the mid-range seemed pulled back, making for a slightly tunnel-like sound with the Cowboy Junkies. Despite that, I noticed fairly okay instrument timbre. For example, the Nork studio tracks had good imaging, but the tuning made the overall timbre a little bit odd. Uncle Wilson insisted I check out EH1 Electrostats from Halo Acoustics, and I already had the Nork studio samples dialed up, so I began listening with these electrostatic prototypes with this music. While I had fairly even tuning, the soundstage was a bit closed in, with Dead Can Dance was a touch edgy in the vocals, maybe due to the small amplifier. There was a bit of blur overall. The bass quality was okay, but there was, not surprisingly, a lack of slam or impact from the drums. Otherwise, fairly even sounding and relaxing electrostatic headphones to listen with. Many people told me that I really should have listened to Bryce's Fugaku at over 2 million yen for a set. I have been really keen to check these out. Now, of course, I had extremely high expectations from these IEMs and their included amplifier, especially given the price. Now, the thing is, though, that the quality of the very top IEMs has jumped considerably, and due to the very high bar set by IEMs I'd already listened with at the show, I maybe wasn't quite as impressed as I hoped to be. Now, I was hooking up the Hugo 2 directly to their amp via a 3.5mm to 4.4mm adapter, and with that, Indus from Dead Can Dance was full sounding with incredible bass rumble. Now, the vocals didn't have perfect clarity, but the result was otherwise excellent. The piano timbre on Yuko Mabuchi's performance of Miles Davis's Nardis wasn't quite there compared to some of the top IEMs on audition by that time. The single point mic sampler recording of John Abercrombie playing John's Waltz was very pleasantly spacious, but with the bass overwhelming the instruments a bit. Carmen Gomes, Don't Let Me Be Misunderstood, had slightly sibilant vocals, however the intensity was high and the sense of sound space was quite amazing at the same time. Percussion was quite excellent, although maybe not 100% convincing in terms of timbre. Some of the micro details of Carmen's voice though were readily apparent. Overall, that Fugaku set is quite amazing, but with a couple of small flaws that aren't present in many flagship IEMs under $10,000, or even $5,000 for that matter, let alone what the Fugaku costs.
So hi, I'm Andrew from DCS, and I thought I'd just give you a little sneak peek what's inside Lena. So there were two things I really wanted to draw your attention to with Lena. The first thing is the chassis construction. So most audio products, the chassis is a box, by which I mean it has flat sides that are either bent or bolted together. As you can probably see here, the chassis of the Lena, this is the bottom plate, is milled from solid billets of aluminium. So you can see the milling marks here. So this would have been a billet that's sort of 3 centimeters thick, and that's been milled down into this exact shape. That's also true. If you look inside this end piece, you can also see the milling marks. Now, that gives us a number of advantages. One of the advantages is, as you can probably see here, in a box construction, you need spacers. They're like little turrets that you mount circuit boards and things on. Whereas when we're milling the chassis, we can mill the spacers into the chassis itself. And while we're doing that, we can also drill them and tap them, which means that to mount something to one of these, you don't need a nut, you just need a bolt. So for every mounting point for a circuit board, we're using 2 components less with this construction because we don't need a separate spacer and we don't need a separate nut. We just bolt the board directly to the chassis. A couple of other advantages with this, apart from being mechanically very much more inert than a flat panel, so we lower the resonant frequency quite a long way. We also have fewer seams. Any seam joined between 2 plates is a leakage point for EMI, so this is a much more EMI tight design. But one of the other advantages of the milled construction is that we can kind of tailor the case to the needs of the circuit board that's inside it. So for instance, if I have a component that generates a lot of heat, I can leave a thicker piece of chassis and we can mount the component directly to that, so the chassis becomes a heat sink. If I have something like sensitive like a clock that requires EMI shielding, I can mill a wall into the chassis and I can hide the clock behind it. So instead of needing separate shields and separate heat sinks, I can mill all of that into the chassis itself. The second thing I want to draw your attention to is this. So this looks like 5 or 6 separate circuit boards. This is actually one circuit board. So this is a technology that's known as flex rigid. So we've basically taken one 30 by 50 centimeter circuit board, and it's like audio origami. We fold it up and we can put it in a case the size of a shoebox. So the flex rigid technology is really interesting. Has a couple of electrical advantages. So as I said, this is one board, and basically the rigid part of the substrate has been removed, and what remains here are the copper tracks of the circuit board itself. So this is a 12-layer board. So in each of these flexible joints, there are 12 layers of conductor, 12 layers of traces encapsulated in a resin that's flexible, which means that the circuit board itself can bend and flex. Now, because we have uniform copper traces here, anytime you get a join between two materials in a circuit, you get an impedance mismatch. If you manage it well, that's a very, very small one, but it's still there. Whereas every plane, every one of the 12 planes on this board has a completely uniform impedance, which means that the circuit mirrors the theoretical performance much more closely. The other problem when you have joins, like in a ribbon cable contains pins which are held by small springs. And any time you have a join between two materials, you have a potential point of failure. So the springs can fatigue, they can lose their grip, the pins can get oxidized, you can get dirt. That's basically a potential point of failure or point of problems. And we generally have fairly reliable products. We have very low failure rates, but where we get failures in our products, it's almost always at one of those connector points that the problem occurs. Whereas in this flex rigid design, we have far fewer connection points because the whole circuit is contained on one single board. So the really interesting thing is what happens when you combine the two, the flex rigid with the milled construction. Because again, if I have one of those milled in details in the chassis, such as a heatsink, I can just fold the component to be able to place it on the heatsink. If I have a shield, I can just fold the sensitive thing down behind it and mount it directly. So the combination of flex rigid technology and the milled construction is a really, really powerful combination. And I think the really most exciting thing about this is both the flex rigid circuit board construction and the milled chassis construction are much more costly than the traditional approaches. But because we use far less discrete mounting components, the assembly time for this is so much less than the assembly time would be if it was constructed in a traditional way. This takes 15 minutes to assemble in the factory using the chassis kit and the board kit, whereas our previous generation of products took 3 days because we had to assemble them iteratively and test after every successive iteration of assembly.
Various people had ranted to me about the Hex and that I had to try them, but as someone else was, I first tried a prototype IEM with specifications of 1 dynamic, 4 balanced armature and 1 planar driver. Now that IEM gave Carmen Gomes good vocal presence with the excellent separation and soundstage that felt realistic, alongside excellent timbre. The bass from Indus, from Dead Can Dance, was outstanding, powerful without being overblown, and treble detailed without brightness. Vocals were clear despite the prominent bass, and the overall frequency response was coherent, with the entire sound coming together as a single thing. Overall, absolutely outstanding. I wonder if they could get any better than that. And then I listened to the Hex. Now, with 6 different types of drivers, each having their own characteristics, it took the company a 10-way crossover to get them all working together. And given they each have different physical characteristics and how they perform, that was pretty amazing. And the result was even more dynamic in both the micro and macro than the prototype I had just tried, which I then thought was outstanding. The treble was a bit more lively than the prototype, when the prototype had been really spot on for me. Similarly, the vocals are a touch back for my preferences, but absolutely clear, with totally without masking from the prominent bass, which is something I have never heard done so well before, except in the highest end speakers. In fact, what really surprised me was how even if the IEMs have the kind of elevated bass that isn't my preference, it had zero negative effect on the vocals, or the treble for that matter, or instruments, in any of the tracks I tried. Absolutely remarkable stuff. Violins and stringed instruments in, say, the Nork Studio tracks were nuanced and clear. Wayne Shorter's Infant Eyes, a direct tape to DSD recording, was an emotional experience, the subtleties of the way he played each note very readily apparent. Overall, while I would have preferred the Hex with the tuning of the prototype, the performance with music elevated above pretty much everything I'd heard that day. I had a quick listen to Alpha and Omega's Fulgrim, and this IEM is limited to only 69 units, and the final version will have a metal embossed phoenix on it, which looks stunning in person. Now, I felt that they had mostly good coherency, and the treble was a touch bright to my taste with only a small amount of, say, timbre and phase issues.
Hello everyone, my name is Ken Ball from Campfire Audio, and today in Singapore we're releasing our newest earphone, the Alien Brain. Comes in our new leather case. I'll pull this out. So this is a stainless steel black CNC PVD shell. The whole thing is stainless steel with a Alien Brain lid. It's a acrylic 3D print. This is a 5-driver hybrid earphone. So it uses a new type of driver. It's a glass dome 10 millimeter driver with dual magnets, so very powerful neo magnets. And then the mid is produced from 2 mid BAs, and then the high is produced from 2 high BAs. So it's a 5-driver hybrid. And it comes with 2 of our time stream cables, the 4.4 and 3.5. We also include our new high-res dongle, so 32-bit 384 comes with that. And the sound signature of this is very easy to listen to, very dynamic, really good at high volumes too, just the way it was tuned. But the frequency response is very nice, very easy, smooth to listen to. So this is the new Campfire Audio Alien Brain, that one. And then we also released our newest sort of entry-level model, and this is the Axion. And this is our unique 3D printed acrylic shell with a stainless steel PVD spout there. This is detachable, so you can use it interchangeably. You can be left or right because they're the same. But it comes with this really cool cable that is it's terminated straight to our high-res 32-bit 384 DAC. And then it has a microphone, so a 3-button mic, so you can take up calls. And it's intended to you can just wear it straight down, but it's sort of like an on-the-go, like budget-friendly, single driver offering that we have. And the driver on this is really interesting. It's a SCDD, silicon dynamic driver. So the voice coil is sort of like a chip. It's a new type of driver. It's similar to a microplanar, but it's full range, very very warm, full-bodied sound. This is the Axion from Campfire Audio.
I sat down and listened to the range of Campfire IEMs, including the Trifecta, which, believe it or not, due to having missed so many Tokyo shows, I'd never had a chance to listen to. Now, the Trifecta delivers a lovely low bass rumble, which has quite good clarity on Dead Can Dance's Indus. Not the greatest percussion nuance, which wasn't so much of a surprise given that it's only using dynamic drivers, and the treble was also, as a result, somewhat average for the high end. However, it was quite good with Wayne Shorter's Infant Eyes, if not having the best depth and clarity. The Axion is Campfire Audio's budget entry, and it comes with a USB-C cable by default, which is how I evaluated it. Sounding spacious with Melody Gardo's sweet melody, at higher volumes it can be a bit sibilant with slightly boomy bass. Similarly, Michael Bublé's rendition of Come Dance With Me is decently punching if the cymbals are a little bit tizzy. I had to ask Ken if he had run out of astronomical objects to name IEMs after when I listened to the Alien Brain. Ken's experimentation with IEMs, which is rather much like Hi-Fi Man's experimentation with headphones, has brought a mix of praise and criticism, but in the case of the Alien Brain, I'd say there's more to praise than there is to criticize. And at just under $1,000, the Infant Eyes was very pleasant, the nuances of Wayne Shorter's playing very readily apparent. The treble was so clean that I didn't notice it, exactly the kind of thing I like. Percussion timbre was likewise excellent, and there was a great balance between soundstage and dynamics for an IEM, which is, just dead on $1,000. Something more expensive IEMs didn't quite manage. That being said, there's a limit, and Indus rumbles, but maybe not perfectly. And the mid-range is a touch forward, so it won't be a good balance for people who like a more bass and more sparkly treble, such as people who prefer Critical's Meta. Still, it is most enjoyable with acoustic music, if not ideal if you need slam. I did try the Nork Studio samples and found that instrument separation was very good if the overall soundstage felt a touch narrow for such high quality acoustic music. There was good front to back depth, however, if of course not at the high-end levels. Otherwise, the instruments were presented with excellent timbre and detail. Melodic Artification not only had IEMs available, but a prototype of some headphones called the Infinitum. It's an upcoming planar headphone, and as such the headband design which you see in videos and pictures, as well as other aspects such as the cable entry, were not complete. By the time I was getting a little tired of hearing the same tracks and decided to switch up to something else. One of the weirdest albums out there is David Chesky's Spanish Poems, of which there is an interesting rendition of The Girl from Guatemala. Now this was presented by the Infinitum in a manner that was quite spacious, but with good intensity, and there was some edginess in the treble, and the mid-range sounded a little bit dark. Unfortunately, I picked up some harshness in the upper mids. Now Indus had a good but less strong bass, vocals a bit muffled and edgy, and it was weird because the shakers were so clean, as were the drums. And the Nork studio track sounded a little bit weird due to the uneven frequency response. This was similar to their IEM, the Alter Ego, and this IEMs do something I wish more would, which is offable switchable tuning via dip switches. In the first mode, the Alter Ego had a fairly excellent instrument timbre, but a similar dip in the mid-range as the headphones had. Not so severe, but it did give instruments a slightly dark tone. Treble was so good that you didn't think about it, again something I really like, and the soundstage sounded deep, but maybe a little bit distant, possibly as a result of the weird frequency response. Carmen Gomes' vocals came across as a bit dark, and as a result her position in the soundstage didn't seem quite right. In the second mode, the issue I had with the vocals was somewhat fixed, although still slightly imbalanced. An instrument sounded better too, but the bass was a little bit more mid-bass focused. In the end, I'm not sure what they were aiming at with the tuning, but hearing a range of notes from one instrument coming through with different intensities didn't sound quite right. The RAAL dealer also is the dealer in Singapore for VIVA. And if there's one thing I hadn't expected, it was that I would have sat down to such a setup and not been blown away because I just spent a day and a half listening to high-end IEMs. And that's not to say that every time I've tried one or another of the RAAL ribbon headphones that they haven't been amazing, as music coming through which is very open, very spacious, and with absolutely magic dynamics and insane micro detail is the exact kind of thing I really look for in my listening. However, maybe due to the source, which was an ever solo streamer, I wasn't quite so impressed with how cymbals sounded. And Dead Can Dance had me scratching my head a bit about the mid-range frequency response as well, which wasn't totally convincing to me. Most significantly, like the requisite, the low bass is weak and preventing them from being good all-rounders, even if they do deliver amazing dynamics and detail in the mid-range and treble.
Hello everybody, my name is Danny from DITA Audio. We've been doing this for about 12-15 years now, and I'm very happy today to be presenting two products. On the low end of the scale, we have the Prelude, which is an entry-level product. This is not a finished thing, but then it's a prototype. Single dynamic driver, because that's what we're normally known for. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we've got the Ventura. Ventura is our new flagship. The last time we built a flagship was the Perpetua, and that was coming to maybe 2 years ago. I think most of our fans and people that know us know that we don't come out with product that frequently. It takes us quite a long time to develop a new flagship. We've had a few products in between that have been quite successful. You may have heard of the Project M, that sold really well for us. But we're going back to our roots a little bit with a single dynamic driver, both on the entry-level Prelude and the Ventura. And on the Prelude, we like to call it an ETOTL, which actually means an economical or entry-level top-of-the-line product, because we think that at that price point, it's going to outperform a lot of products. The other thing that we're very, very well known for is the way that we build our products. So we build them to last. Most times we like working with metals, CNC machining. I have a background in mechanical engineering, so that's something that we like to work with a lot. You're going to see that a lot in both the Prelude as an entry-level product, and you're going to see even more on the 9-piece construction Ventura, which is fully made out of titanium and then assembled with a somewhat exotic driver. It's made of a titanium ceramic base on the diaphragm and then a PVD gold coating on top of it. But I think what's most interesting about the Ventura driver is the quad baffle. So behind the diaphragm are 4 baffles, and that's what creates the illusion of space. I believe it will be a new space for us as far as what we can do with a single dynamic driver.
The Prelude, the slightly V-shaped sound typical of modern audiophile IEMs, with some mid-bass, but it wasn't overblown listening to, say, the Cowboy Junkies' Shining Moon. Song of the Stars from Dead Can Dance had good rumble, if it was still a little bit bright. However, it wasn't too much, instead making the song exciting. And there's a good sense of instrument separation for the price. The piano, for example, on Wayne Shorter's Infant Eyes sounded slightly off timbre, possibly from phase issues, but otherwise there were no major faults, and I'd say they're pretty excellent for the price. The Ventura model was available in two different flavours. There was the silver and the black, each with a different tuning. The silver model delivered Wayne Shorter's Infant Eyes more aggressively, which felt more real, if you've ever heard the instruments up close and live. They were more macro than micro in terms of detail, but this didn't feel overemphasized. The transitions between quiet and loud are excellent and come across effortlessly. I had thought in the first moments that the sound was bright, but it was just more the more real dynamics as notes across the frequency spectrum from low to high were presented in the same way, so none of that uneven tuning that some IEMs I listened to had. Song of the Stars, for example, had rumble, but it wasn't at the level of really shaking, even if the dynamics were excellent overall. With this and similar tracks, I felt they were a touch aggressive or even bright, and the sound reminded me of how ribbon speakers and how the RAAL sounded. Carmen Gomes had the double bass at the start delivered with great clarity, and there was excellent front to back depth. I felt that the vocals may still be a touch aggressive for some people, even if it's probably more realistic. Guitar plucks are RAAL light clear, and the only negative was the percussion had the slightest maybe phase or timbre issues, which I put down to being a dynamic driver characteristic. Now the black version had a different tuning with less aggressive and darker mid-range and a fuller sound. Vocals were still a touch sharp all the same, which led my thoughts above about it being a dynamic driver thing, and I think the silver played better into the strengths of the driver rather than trying to compensate for them. Still, the black version was highly engaging. The Hercules Audio Moses IEMs was one that someone had recommended to me, and Carmen Gomes through them is a little bit bright, with almost the aggressive sound the DITA Silver prototype had, but with better percussion timbre. Guitar nuance was great, and I think percussion had a bit of the what I used to call the balanced armature treble sound. Vocal frequency response was very slightly odd around the upper mid-range too. Double bass notes at different frequencies were a little bit different, giving a sense that the frequency response overall was slightly uneven. Dead Can Dance's Song of the Stars had excellent rumble, but the shakers still sounded a touch sibilant. Some of the mid-range bass could have also had a touch more slam. As the show came to a close, I was listening to the legendary Subtomic Storm IEMs, and probably the most requested IEM that I listened to, and with a reputation of being very difficult to drive, it was ideal for using with something like the Enlium. Ironically, the battery on the Enlium ran out dead on 5 PM, and I did a lot of listening directly from the Hugo too. Now, while the Storm has a brighter tilt, it sounded coherent. It doesn't have quite enough rumble on Song of the Stars for preference, but it balances this up by delivering quite an intense amount of detail. Each word sang out was delivered intently, resulting in a quite dramatic presentation. The more I listened, the more overwhelming the way the details were delivered. Listening to The Girl from Guatemala from that David Chesky album, I noted that the Storm delivered good depth directly from the Hugo too, but there was definitely better intensity from the Enlium. The treble was almost good enough not to think about, so near perfect for me in that regard. Wayne Shorter's Infant Eyes was also delivered smoothly with a lot of detail, for the most part, though sometimes I felt like it was a touch hot and intense. Ultimately, I wish I'd had 4 days, not just 2, to evaluate all the stuff that was available on the show floor. There was so much that I missed and so much that I wanted to try. But all the same, I was so happy that everyone who came up to me, met me, chatted with me, and gave me suggestions and ideas. And overall, it was a fantastic place to meet, chat with people, and have a great deal of fun, and try out a lot of really great gear. Thank you again to Hi-Fi Man, all my patrons, the HeadFi team, and everyone who helped out in making this show report possible. And I look forward to seeing you both online and at the next show. Don't forget that you can support my work and also get my buying advice and help with your audio setup, both on Buy Me a Coffee and Patreon.com.